In the spring of 1945, as Nazi Germany's Third Reich crumbled under the relentless advance of Allied forces, a single military operation would defy every expectation of modern warfare. While battles raged across Europe, claiming thousands of lives daily, one Canadian general would accomplish what seemed impossible: liberating an entire capital city without firing a shot, without spilling a single drop of blood. This is the story of how General Charles Foulkes achieved the unthinkable in Amsterdam, and why Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower's subsequent report to President Franklin D. Roosevelt would change how military historians understood the true art of warfare. The Desperate Winter. The winter of 1944 to 1945 became known as the Hunger Winter, the Hunger Winter. Amsterdam's citizens were dying at a rate of more than 400 people per week. The Nazi occupation had turned the once prosperous Dutch capital into a graveyard of the living. Children's faces hollowed into skeletal masks. Mothers clutched infants too weak to cry. The elderly simply disappeared, their bodies collected each morning from doorways and alleys where they had collapsed the night before. The German occupiers, led by Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart, had implemented a policy of deliberate starvation. When the Dutch government in exile called for a railway strike to support Operation Market Garden, Seyss-Inquart retaliated by blocking all food shipments into the Western Netherlands. Over 4 million people faced systematic starvation. The Nazi strategy was clear: if they couldn't hold the Netherlands, they would make the Dutch people suffer for their resistance. By April 1945, Amsterdammers were eating tulip bulbs. They stripped bark from trees in public parks. They ground down leather shoes to make a bitter soup. The city's famous canals, once sparkling with commerce and life, now served as open sewers where disease festered. Typhoid swept through neighborhoods. Tuberculosis claimed entire families. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, received intelligence reports that made his blood run cold. His staff estimated that without immediate intervention, another 100,000 Dutch civilians would die before summer. But liberating Amsterdam presented an impossible military puzzle. The city was a fortress of water and stone. The Germans had flooded vast sections of the countryside, creating an impassable barrier of lakes and marshes. Every bridge was wired with explosives. Every major building had been converted into a defensive position. Nazi commanders had made it clear: if Allied forces attempted to take Amsterdam by force, they would demolish the entire city, blow the dikes and flood the region, drowning tens of thousands. Eisenhower faced a commander's worst nightmare. A direct assault would save the city from starvation but destroy it in the process. Waiting for the Germans to surrender would mean watching helpless as thousands died each day. He needed a third option, something that had never been attempted in modern warfare. The Canadian general. Charles Foulkes was not the kind of general who sought glory. Born in Stockton-on-Tees, England, and raised in Ontario, Canada, he had risen through the ranks not through battlefield heroics but through meticulous planning and an uncanny ability to understand both his enemies and his allies. While other generals sought dramatic victories, Foulkes studied the psychology of warfare, the delicate balance between force and diplomacy. By April 1945, Foulkes commanded the 1st Canadian Corps, positioned on the outskirts of Amsterdam. His soldiers were battle-hardened veterans of the Italian campaign and the liberation of Belgium and northern France. They had seen the worst of the war, fought through the Gothic Line, endured the brutal winter fighting in the Rhineland. They were ready to fight, ready to storm Amsterdam's defenses if ordered. But Foulkes had been receiving his own intelligence reports, and what he read changed his perspective entirely. German commanders in Amsterdam were tired. Not just battle-weary but psychologically exhausted. They knew the war was lost. Hitler's suicide was days away, though no one knew it yet. The Wehrmacht officers in Amsterdam were career soldiers, not fanatics. They had families, homes they wanted to return to. They understood that history would judge them. More importantly, Foulkes learned that the German commanders feared their own SS units more than they feared the Canadians. SS Obergruppenführer Hans Albin Rauter, the higher SS and police leader in the Netherlands, was a true believer, a fanatic who would indeed destroy Amsterdam rather than surrender it. But the Wehrmacht generals despised Rauter. They saw him as a barbarian, a criminal who had turned their honorable profession into mass murder. Foulkes saw an opening. What if he could negotiate not with the Nazi leadership, but with the Wehrmacht officers who secretly wanted to end the bloodshed? What if he could offer them something they valued more than a glorious last stand? The secret channel. The initial contact came through the Dutch resistance, a network of ordinary citizens who had risked everything to undermine the Nazi occupation. A message reached Foulkes through coded channels. German General Johannes Blaskowitz, commander of Army Group H, was willing to discuss terms for Amsterdam's surrender, but not officially. He couldn't be seen negotiating with the enemy while SS observers watched his every move. Foulkes took an enormous risk. Without explicit authorization from Eisenhower, he sent his own representative, a Canadian intelligence officer who spoke fluent German and had experience in psychological operations, into German-held territory under a white flag. The officer carried a simple message: surrender Amsterdam intact, and Foulkes would guarantee the safety and humane treatment of all German forces. Fight and there would be no mercy, no quarter given. But Foulkes added something else to his offer, something that revealed his deep understanding of human psychology. He promised that if the Germans surrendered peacefully, they would be treated not as war criminals but as professional soldiers. Their honor would be respected. They would be repatriated to Germany as soon as hostilities ended. And most importantly, Foulkes would personally testify that they had acted to prevent further civilian casualties. The German officers were shocked. In years of brutal warfare, no one had ever offered them respect, recognition of their professionalism. The Nazis had turned them into instruments of genocide. The Allies had declared them all war criminals. Now a Canadian general was offering them a way to end the war with their dignity intact. But there was a problem. The SS. Rauter's fanatics controlled key positions throughout Amsterdam. They had orders to destroy the city's infrastructure, to blow the dikes, to make the Dutch people pay for their resistance. Even if Blaskowitz wanted to surrender, the SS would fight to the last man. Foulkes made another calculated gamble. Through back channels he sent word to the Wehrmacht officers. If you can neutralize the SS positions in Amsterdam without firing a shot, if you can prevent them from demolishing the city, then I will accept your surrender before we even enter the city. You will save Amsterdam, and history will remember you not as Nazis but as the men who chose humanity over ideology. The internal coup. What happened next has never been fully documented. German military archives from the final days of the war are fragmentary at best. But from Dutch resistance records and post-war interrogations, historians have pieced together an extraordinary story. On the night of April 28, 1945, Wehrmacht officers throughout Amsterdam received coded orders. They were told that SS units were planning to destroy the city's water treatment facilities and blow the major dikes at dawn. This was partially true, Rauter had indeed given such orders. But the Wehrmacht officers also received instructions. They were to quietly surround SS positions, cut their communications and if necessary place them under arrest. It was an internal coup, German soldiers turning against other German soldiers to save a city full of people they had occupied for 5 years. In the darkness before dawn, Wehrmacht units moved silently through Amsterdam's streets. They positioned machine gun nests outside SS headquarters. They cut telephone lines. They disabled vehicles. By sunrise, the SS forces in Amsterdam found themselves isolated, surrounded by their own countrymen. Rauter himself was never arrested. He had already fled Amsterdam days earlier, wounded in a firefight with Dutch resistance. But his subordinates, finding themselves cut off and facing Wehrmacht guns, had a choice: start a civil war in Amsterdam's streets or stand down. Most chose to stand down. By noon on April 29, General Blaskowitz sent a coded message to Foulkes. Amsterdam is secure. The demolition charges have been removed. The dikes are safe. We are ready to discuss terms. Foulkes immediately contacted Eisenhower. What he proposed was unprecedented. He wanted to accept the German surrender of Amsterdam without Canadian forces even entering the city. He would allow the Wehrmacht to maintain order for another 24 hours while they completed the removal of all explosives and ensured that remaining SS elements were contained. Only then would Canadian forces enter Amsterdam, not as conquerors storming the gates, but as liberators walking through open doors. Eisenhower's staff thought Foulkes had lost his mind. It was a trap, they insisted. The Germans would use the delay to regroup, to reinforce their positions. This was military insanity. But Eisenhower understood what Foulkes was attempting. He had spent the entire war trying to minimize civilian casualties while defeating the Nazi war machine. He had seen too many cities reduced to rubble, too many civilians caught in the crossfire. If Foulkes could liberate Amsterdam without losing a single soldier, Canadian or German, without destroying a single building, it would be a victory unlike any other in the war. Eisenhower approved the plan. But he added one condition: if this goes wrong, if it's a trap, you answer for it personally. Foulkes accepted those terms without hesitation. The longest day, May 2, 1945, dawned clear and bright over Amsterdam. Canadian soldiers stood at their positions on the city's outskirts, weapons loaded, tanks fueled, ready to assault if the agreement fell apart. Inside Amsterdam, German soldiers worked frantically to defuse explosives, to clear defensive positions, to remove the machinery of occupation. Dutch citizens, starving and desperate, didn't know what was happening. They had lived with the sound of artillery fire in the distance for weeks. They expected the liberation of Amsterdam to sound like the liberation of every other European city: explosions, gunfire, destruction. Instead they heard nothing. The silence was terrifying. Foulkes himself crossed into German-held territory that morning, accompanied only by a small security detail and a translator. It was an act of profound courage or profound foolishness, depending on your perspective. He drove through streets lined with Wehrmacht soldiers, past machine gun positions that could have cut him down in seconds. He entered the German headquarters in Amsterdam and sat down across from General Blaskowitz. The two men spoke for less than an hour. There are no transcripts of that conversation, no official record of what was said. But witnesses reported that it was cordial, professional, two career soldiers recognizing that the war was ending and their duty now was to preserve life, not to destroy it. At exactly 2 p.m. on May 2, 1945, German forces in Amsterdam formally surrendered to General Charles Foulkes. White flags appeared on buildings throughout the city. Wehrmacht soldiers laid down their weapons and organized formations, maintaining discipline even in defeat. And then, for the first time in 5 years, the Dutch began to emerge from their homes. They came slowly at first, uncertain, afraid this might be another Nazi trick. But as Canadian soldiers began entering Amsterdam, not fighting but simply walking through the streets, the reality became clear. The occupation was over. The war had passed them by without reducing their city to ruins. The celebration that erupted in Amsterdam that afternoon was unlike anything witnessed in the entire war. People who had been starving for months found the energy to dance in the streets. Orange flags, hidden for 5 years, suddenly appeared on every building. Canadians were mobbed by grateful crowds, kissed by young women, embraced by old men who wept openly. But the most remarkable moment came when the first food convoys entered Amsterdam. Foulkes had coordinated with Allied supply units to have trucks loaded with bread, milk, medical supplies, and emergency rations ready to roll into the city the moment the surrender was official. Within hours of liberation, food was being distributed to neighborhoods that hadn't seen adequate supplies in 6 months. Not a single shot had been fired. Not one building had been destroyed. Not one Canadian soldier had been killed or wounded. And while German casualties weren't zero, the handful of injuries sustained in the Wehrmacht's internal operation to neutralize the SS were minor. For the first time in the entire Second World War, a major European capital had been liberated without bloodshed. Eisenhower's report. 3 days later, General Eisenhower sat in his headquarters in Reims, France, composing what would be one of the most important documents of his military career. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had died on April 12, just 3 weeks earlier, but before his death, he had specifically requested that Eisenhower keep him personally informed of the situation in Amsterdam. Now Eisenhower wrote to President Harry S. Truman, Roosevelt's successor, to explain what Charles Foulkes had accomplished. The report, classified for decades after the war, revealed Eisenhower's deep admiration for Foulkes's approach and his recognition that this operation represented something profound about the nature of military leadership. Eisenhower wrote that Foulkes had understood something that many generals never grasp. The objective of war is not destruction but resolution. Every battle won through violence, no matter how necessary, represents a failure of imagination. Foulkes had imagined a different path, one where victory came not from superior firepower but from superior understanding of human psychology. More importantly, Eisenhower noted that Foulkes had saved Allied lives as well as German and Dutch lives. Every soldier who didn't have to fight in Amsterdam was a soldier who lived to return home. Every building that wasn't destroyed was a building that didn't need to be rebuilt. Every civilian who didn't die in crossfire was a civilian who could help rebuild their nation. But Eisenhower also included a warning in his report. He wrote that what Foulkes accomplished in Amsterdam could not be replicated everywhere. It worked because of unique circumstances: German commanders who were ready to surrender, an SS that was already weakened and isolated, a Dutch population that maintained its resistance network, and most importantly, a narrow window of time when the war was clearly ending but before Hitler's final orders for scorched earth destruction had been fully implemented. Eisenhower concluded his report with a recommendation that would shape post-war military doctrine. Sometimes the greatest act of leadership is choosing not to fight. He urged that Foulkes be recognized not just for liberating Amsterdam, but for demonstrating that there are alternatives to the brutal arithmetic of warfare, alternatives that require more courage and creativity than simply ordering an assault. President Truman read Eisenhower's report and immediately requested more details. He was fascinated by the idea that a major military objective could be achieved without violence. As someone who would soon face the decision about whether to use atomic weapons against Japan, Truman understood the importance of exploring every possible alternative to maximize destruction. The aftermath. In the days and weeks following Amsterdam's liberation, the full scope of what Foulkes had achieved became clear. Medical teams entering the city found that while malnutrition was widespread and many were seriously ill, the death rate immediately plummeted once food supplies were restored. Hospitals that had been preparing for mass casualties from urban warfare instead focused on treating starvation and disease. The psychological impact on survivors was also profound. They had been liberated, not rescued from the ruins of their city. The German soldiers who surrendered under Foulkes' terms were treated exactly as promised. They were disarmed, processed as prisoners of war, and held in conditions that met Geneva Convention standards. When several Wehrmacht officers were later called to testify at war crimes trials, Foulkes kept his word and testified that these specific individuals had acted to prevent atrocities in Amsterdam's final days. This created controversy. Many argued that no Nazi officer deserved such consideration, that all German military personnel were complicit in the Holocaust and other war crimes. Foulkes responded that justice required distinguishing between those who committed atrocities and those who prevented them. The Wehrmacht officers who neutralized the SS in Amsterdam, who removed demolition charges, who chose to surrender rather than destroy a city full of civilians, deserved recognition for those specific acts, even if they bore responsibility for participating in an evil regime. The Dutch people themselves had complex feelings about the liberation. While they were grateful beyond measure that their city had been spared, some questioned whether the Germans should have been allowed to surrender on such favorable terms. Families who had lost loved ones to Nazi brutality struggled with the idea that Wehrmacht officers were being treated with respect. But most Amsterdammers recognized what Foulkes had given them: their city, their homes, their future. Unlike Warsaw, Rotterdam, or Dresden, Amsterdam emerged from the war battered but intact. The physical infrastructure that would be needed to rebuild their society, the hospitals and schools and factories and homes, had been preserved. The death toll from liberation was zero. Historical significance. Military historians continue to debate what Amsterdam's liberation reveals about warfare and leadership. Some argue it was an anomaly, a unique set of circumstances that could never be replicated. Others see it as a template for how conflicts might be resolved if commanders prioritized civilian safety and were willing to think creatively about achieving objectives. What's undeniable is that Foulkes demonstrated several principles that have since been incorporated into modern military doctrine. First, understanding your enemy's psychology can be as powerful as understanding their tactical capabilities. Second, offering dignified surrender terms can sometimes achieve more than threats of annihilation. Third, the best victory is one where everyone, even the defeated enemy, has an incentive to ensure the outcome succeeds. The Amsterdam operation also highlighted the importance of civil-military cooperation. The Dutch resistance provided crucial intelligence and communication channels. Their willingness to trust Foulkes' approach, to not demand immediate violent retribution against the occupiers, created space for negotiation. Without their cooperation, the Germans would never have believed that peaceful surrender was a viable option. Perhaps most importantly, Amsterdam demonstrated that military leadership in its highest form requires moral courage as much as physical courage. Foulkes risked his career, his reputation, and potentially his life on the belief that there was a better way to achieve his objective. He could have simply ordered an assault, followed conventional military doctrine, and no one would have questioned his decision. Instead, he chose the harder path, the one that required imagination and faith in human decency even in the midst of war. Roosevelt's legacy. Although Franklin D. Roosevelt died before Amsterdam's liberation, his influence on Eisenhower's thinking was profound. Roosevelt had consistently pushed his military commanders to consider the political and humanitarian dimensions of their operations. He understood that how the war ended would shape the post-war world. Liberating cities as heaps of rubble would create bitterness and instability. Preserving civilian populations and infrastructure would speed recovery and reconciliation. When Eisenhower wrote his report on Amsterdam, he was fulfilling Roosevelt's vision of warfare that balanced military necessity with humanitarian concern. The report became part of Roosevelt's posthumous legacy, evidence that American military leadership had matured beyond simple calculations of force and destruction. Truman, reading Eisenhower's words, recognized that he was seeing a glimpse of what post-war military operations might look like. As the United States transitioned from defeating fascism to containing communism, as the Cold War began to take shape, the lessons of Amsterdam suggested that American power might be most effective when it was restrained, when it created opportunities for adversaries to choose peace over conflict. The human cost avoided. To truly understand what Foulkes accomplished, consider what didn't happen in Amsterdam. Based on urban warfare statistics from other European cities, a conventional assault on Amsterdam would likely have killed between 2,000 and 5,000 Canadian soldiers. German casualties would have been even higher, perhaps 10,000 dead and wounded. But the real catastrophe would have been among civilians. If the Germans had fought for Amsterdam, if they had implemented their plans to flood the surrounding areas and demolish the city's infrastructure, the civilian death toll could have reached 50,000 or more. The already starving population would have been trapped in a war zone without food, water, or medical care. Hospitals would have been destroyed. Disease would have swept through the ruins. Even after liberation, the destruction would have continued to kill. Without functioning water systems, typhoid and cholera would have claimed thousands. Without intact housing, exposure would have killed the elderly and children. Without food distribution infrastructure, starvation would have persisted for months. Foulkes didn't just save the people who were alive on May 2, 1945. He saved everyone who would have died in the months and years following a destructive liberation. He saved the children who grew up in intact homes with their parents alive. He saved the culture and history preserved in buildings that weren't reduced to rubble. He saved the social fabric of a city that could begin healing immediately rather than spending years simply surviving. The silent heroes. While Foulkes received recognition for Amsterdam's liberation, many others played crucial roles in the operation. The Canadian intelligence officers who established contact with German commanders risked execution as spies. The Dutch resistance members who facilitated communication between the sides operated under constant threat of SS retaliation. The Wehrmacht officers who chose to neutralize their SS comrades committed what their own superiors would have considered treason. Even the average Canadian soldiers who waited outside Amsterdam, ready to fight but willing to give peace a chance, demonstrated extraordinary discipline. These were men who had lost friends to German bullets, who had every reason to want revenge. Yet they followed orders to hold their fire, to trust that their general knew what he was doing, to accept that liberating Amsterdam without killing Germans was still a victory. The German soldiers who surrendered also deserve recognition for their choice. They could have followed Hitler's orders to fight to the last man, to destroy everything rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands. Instead, they chose to preserve life, to act on the recognition that the war was lost and further destruction served no purpose. And the people of Amsterdam, weakened by starvation, living under brutal occupation, somehow maintained their humanity. They didn't seek revenge when liberation came. They didn't attack surrendering German soldiers. They focused on survival, on rebuilding, on moving forward. Their restraint was as important to the operation's success as any military decision. Lessons for modern warfare. The liberation of Amsterdam continues to influence military thinking. Modern peacekeeping operations, humanitarian interventions, and counterinsurgency doctrine all reflect lessons learned from Foulkes' approach. The recognition that understanding cultural context, building local partnerships, and offering adversaries dignified exits from conflict can achieve strategic objectives without maximum force has become central to contemporary military operations. But Amsterdam also serves as a cautionary tale. The operation worked because of unique circumstances that may not exist in other conflicts. Replicating its success requires commanders who possess not just military skill but psychological insight, cultural awareness, and the moral courage to take enormous risks. These qualities are rare. Modern military academies now study Amsterdam as a case study in creative problem-solving under extreme pressure. Officers learn that while conventional solutions often work, unconventional approaches might work better. They're taught to look for opportunities to achieve objectives through negotiation, persuasion, and understanding rather than automatically defaulting to force. The operation also demonstrates the importance of strategic patience. Foulkes could have launched an immediate assault on Amsterdam when he first arrived at its outskirts. Instead, he waited, gathered intelligence, built relationships, and created conditions for peaceful resolution. That patience saved thousands of lives. The price of imagination. Yet Foulkes paid a price for his innovation. Some of his fellow officers never forgave him for treating German commanders with respect. They argued that he had been soft on Nazis, that he had allowed war criminals to escape justice. His post-war career was marked by these controversies, and he never received the level of recognition that other Canadian generals enjoyed. This reveals something important about military culture and human nature. We celebrate commanders who win battles through superior tactics and firepower. We're less comfortable with commanders who win through negotiation and restraint. Violence is easy to understand and measure. Creativity and compassion in warfare make us uncomfortable because they challenge our assumptions about how conflicts should be resolved. Foulkes understood this. In later years, when asked about Amsterdam, he never portrayed himself as having done something extraordinary. He simply said he had found the most efficient way to accomplish his mission with minimum loss of life. That, he insisted, was what any competent commander would do. But we know differently. Most commanders wouldn't have imagined the possibility. Most wouldn't have taken the risk. Most would have followed standard doctrine, launched the assault, and accepted the casualties as the price of victory. Foulkes' genius was in refusing to accept that price when there was an alternative. Eisenhower's broader vision. The Amsterdam operation reinforced Eisenhower's belief that military leadership required not just tactical brilliance but strategic wisdom about how wars end and peace begins. In the final weeks of the war, he made several decisions influenced by Foulkes' example. When German commanders in other Dutch cities offered to surrender under similar terms, Eisenhower authorized his subordinates to negotiate. When Wehrmacht units sought to retreat toward American lines rather than be captured by Soviet forces, Eisenhower permitted it, recognizing that preserving German lives might serve long-term strategic interests even if it complicated Soviet-American relations. Most controversially, Eisenhower rejected Churchill's pleas to drive toward Berlin ahead of Soviet forces. He argued that the political value of capturing Berlin wasn't worth the projected 50,000 Allied casualties such an assault would cost. Better to let the Soviets pay that price while American and British forces secured territory that would become part of the Western occupation zones. Critics accused Eisenhower of being too cautious, of letting political concerns override military opportunities. But Eisenhower had learned from Foulkes that the ultimate objective wasn't winning battles but creating conditions for a stable peace. Preserving Allied lives and strength for the post-war period mattered more than symbolic victories that came at enormous cost. The forgotten liberation. Despite its significance, Amsterdam's liberation remains relatively unknown compared to other events of the war. D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the liberation of Paris, these are the stories that dominate popular memory. Amsterdam's liberation, precisely because it lacked the drama of combat, the visceral appeal of violence overcome by greater violence, has faded from collective consciousness. This says something troubling about how we remember history. We memorialize sacrifices made in battle, the heroes who died storming beaches or holding defensive lines. But we struggle to memorialize wisdom, restraint, and creative problem-solving that prevents deaths from occurring in the first place. The soldiers who didn't die in Amsterdam because Foulkes found another way have no memorial, no monument, no prominent place in history books. Yet their lives saved, their families spared grief, their futures preserved, these represent Foulkes' true victory. Every Canadian soldier who returned home from the war because he didn't have to fight in Amsterdam was a victory. Every German soldier who survived to help rebuild his country was a victory. Every Dutch civilian who lived to see their city flourish again was a victory. The final assessment. When Eisenhower completed his report to Truman about Amsterdam's liberation, he ended with a simple observation. General Foulkes demonstrated that sometimes the highest form of military courage is the courage not to fight. In an age that celebrated warrior virtues, that glorified battlefield heroism, this was a revolutionary statement. Foulkes had shown that true military leadership requires seeing beyond the immediate battle to the ultimate objective. Amsterdam needed to be liberated, but it also needed to survive liberation. Its people needed to be freed, but they also needed their city intact so they could rebuild their lives. Meeting both objectives simultaneously required imagination, psychological insight, and willingness to take enormous personal risk. The operation succeeded because Foulkes understood his enemies as human beings facing impossible choices, not as abstract threats to be eliminated. He recognized that the Wehrmacht officers in Amsterdam were trapped between their oath of loyalty to Germany and their growing recognition that further fighting served no purpose. By offering them a path that honored their professionalism while ending the bloodshed, he gave them what they desperately wanted, a way out. He also understood his allies. The Dutch resistance needed to feel that their suffering had meaning, that liberation represented justice. But they also needed their city to survive. By working with them to facilitate negotiations, by ensuring that liberation brought immediate food relief rather than just replacing one occupying force with another, He showed that he understood what truly mattered to the people he was liberating. And he understood his own soldiers. Canadian troops were ready to fight, willing to die if necessary to complete their mission. But they were also human beings who wanted to survive the war, who were tired of killing, who recognized that the end was near and dying in the final days would be a particular tragedy. By giving them a victory without casualties, he honored their service while preserving their lives. Legacy and reflection. The story of Amsterdam's liberation forces us to reconsider what we mean by military victory. Is it better to win through overwhelming force or through psychological insight? Is a commander who minimizes casualties on all sides, including enemy casualties, more or less successful than a commander who maximizes enemy losses while accepting high friendly casualties? Conventional military wisdom suggests that destroying the enemy's capacity to fight is the path to victory. But Foulkes demonstrated that eliminating the enemy's will to fight can achieve the same objective more efficiently and with better long-term outcomes. Amsterdam didn't need to be conquered. It needed to be freed. Those are different things, and Foulkes understood the difference. His approach required trusting his enemies to keep their word, always a dangerous gamble in warfare. But he created conditions where keeping their word served the Germans' interests. The Wehrmacht officers who negotiated with him gained the possibility of surviving the war with their honor somewhat intact. The alternative, fighting to the end in Amsterdam, offered them nothing but death or capture as war criminals. This reveals something profound about human motivation. We often assume that people in extreme situations like war act solely from ideology or tribalism or orders from above. But most people, even in the midst of terrible conflict, remain rational actors seeking the best outcome for themselves and those they care about. Foulkes recognized this and used it to create an outcome where everyone's interests aligned around peaceful resolution. The unanswered questions. We'll never know everything that happened in Amsterdam in those final days of April and early days of May 1945. The complete story of the Wehrmacht's internal operation to neutralize SS forces remains fragmentary. The full extent of the negotiations between Foulkes and German commanders is partially lost to history, since much was communicated through back channels and intermediaries. We don't know what might have happened if the SS had been stronger, more numerous, more fanatical. We don't know what Foulkes would have done if his gamble had failed, if German commanders had used the negotiating period to reinforce their defenses rather than remove them. We don't know what Eisenhower would have done to Foulkes if the operation had turned into a disaster. These uncertainties are important because they remind us that Foulkes' success wasn't guaranteed. He took an enormous risk based on his assessment of the situation and his understanding of human psychology. He could have been wrong. The fact that he was right, that everything worked out as he hoped, shouldn't obscure how close the operation came to catastrophic failure. But this is true of all great military operations. D-Day could have failed. Market Garden did fail. The march to Berlin could have turned into a bloodbath. Success in warfare always involves risk, judgment, and often luck. What distinguishes great commanders from competent ones is the ability to see possibilities others miss, to take calculated risks others would avoid, to achieve objectives through means others wouldn't consider. Conclusion: the bloodless victory. On May 8, 1945, 6 days after Amsterdam's liberation, Nazi Germany formally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. In the celebration and relief that followed, Amsterdam's liberation was just one event among thousands marking the end of the conflict. But for those who understood what Foulkes had accomplished, it represented something more than a tactical success or a humanitarian gesture. It represented proof that even in total war, even in a conflict as brutal and ideological as the Second World War, there were alternatives to maximum violence. It proved that military commanders who combined tactical skill with psychological insight and moral courage could achieve their objectives while minimizing human suffering. It proved that treating enemies as human beings capable of rational choice could be more effective than treating them as obstacles to be eliminated. When Eisenhower told Truman about Amsterdam's liberation, he wasn't just reporting on a successful operation. He was articulating a vision of military leadership that balanced force with restraint, that pursued victory while preserving humanity, that recognized the ultimate purpose of warfare is not destruction but resolution. This vision would influence how the United States approached conflicts for decades to come, for better and worse. The bloodless liberation of Amsterdam stands as one of the war's most remarkable achievements precisely because it defies our expectations about what war requires. We expect violence, sacrifice, destruction. We expect that important objectives can only be achieved through willingness to pay terrible prices. Foulkes showed that sometimes the greatest victories come from refusing to accept that logic, from insisting that there must be a better way, and from having the courage to find it. In the end, what Eisenhower told Roosevelt, or what he would have told Roosevelt if the president had lived to hear it, was simple. One Canadian general demonstrated what the highest form of military leadership looks like. He liberated an entire city, saved thousands of lives, and defeated his enemy without losing a single man. That's not just a tactical success. It's a triumph of imagination, courage, and humanity in the midst of history's most terrible war. And that triumph, more than any battlefield victory, pointed toward the kind of military leadership the post-war world would need, a leadership that understood force as a last resort rather than a first response, that treated preservation of life as the highest objective, that recognized winning the peace mattered as much as winning the war. Amsterdam survived. Its people survived. And General Charles Foulkes proved that sometimes the greatest act of courage is choosing not to fight.